Heartbeats. A Ferndale Farm Romantic Comedy. Book 1. By Mazy Morris. You are listening to an AI-narrated complete audiobook. If you'd rather read this novella, you can find a link to the ebook version in the video description. Chapter 1. There is nothing traditional about holding a funeral in an apple orchard in full bloom. There's also nothing conventional about the deceased requesting to have his ashes mixed with poppy seeds and broadcast onto the dandelions and knee-high weeds in the unmown rows between the trees. The small apple orchard sat on the side of a hill and overlooked the rest of Ferndale Farm, my late Uncle Jim's home, livelihood, and final resting place. There was certainly nothing traditional about the small herd of pygmy goats that grazed nearby while my Uncle Jim's best friend, Fred McGonagall, who took great pride in his Scottish heritage, played a dirge on the bagpipes. But then my Uncle Jim was anything but conventional. I couldn't believe Uncle Jim was gone. Just 3 weeks ago, he'd been admitted to the hospital, and 9 days later, he had left us. Now his widow, Alice, stood knee-deep in the weeds between the rows of blooming apple trees, clutching the empty urn to her chest, tears running down her cheeks as Fred squawked away on the bagpipes. Fred had not opted for a kilt. Instead, he wore what he always wore, a pair of threadbare overalls. He'd made one small concession to acknowledge the solemnity of the occasion by putting on a shirt and tie underneath the overalls. The effect was somewhat marred by the fact that the tie had a retro pin-up girl on it. When the dirge ended, Mateo, Uncle Jim's right-hand man at Ferndale Farm, gave me a little dig in the ribs with his elbow and said, "Here you go, Red." My name is Ciara, but Mateo has always called me Red on account of my hair. Mateo awkwardly handed me his clean, folded-up bandana. It was only then that I realized Alice was not the only one who had tears running down her cheeks. "Thank you," I mumbled. I didn't look over at Mateo when I took the hanky. Mateo and I went to high school together, and we've always been like oil and water. On any other occasion, we'd have already picked an argument about something. It wouldn't matter what. I'd once remarked on the startling blueness of the sky, and Mateo had shot back with some nonsense about how the sky isn't really blue, it just looks blue because blue light gets scattered more than other colors because blue light travels in shorter, smaller waves. I just rolled my eyes when Mateo told me that, but I looked it up later and found out that he was right. I hated when Mateo was right. I wasn't used to Mateo feeling sorry for me, although I imagined I looked pretty pitiful, what with all the sleepless nights and crying I'd been doing for the past 3 weeks. I wiped my eyes with Mateo's bandana. I needed to blow my nose, and I probably could have gotten away with it under cover of Fred's piping, but just as I was gearing up to clear my clogged nasal passages, Fred broke off his dirge, and I had to make do with sniffing. I'd meant to sniff sedately, but instead, it turned into an undignified snort. That spooked one of the little pygmies as it gambled past and made Alice turn around and look in my direction. I think she may have been worried that the bull had gotten loose and was about to menace the mourners. Having finished his duties of piping Uncle Jim on to the great blue yonder, as my uncle was so fond of referring to it, Fred informed us all that we were instructed to go down to the house where we'd have barbecue, pie, and whiskey. Barbecue, pie, and whiskey were my Uncle Jim's favorite things in the world unless you counted farming and Alice. I couldn't help wondering what would become of Ferndale Farm now. I worked for my uncle, and I had the dirt under my fingernails to prove it. We'd been halfway through planting the east field full of beets when Uncle Jim had been hospitalized. There were still flats of unplanted seedlings sitting in the greenhouse. Thank goodness we'd gotten the early potatoes planted before he'd collapsed. Uncle Jim had been resistant to hiring enough help, and during whispered conversations with Alice at the hospital, I'd realized it had less to do with Uncle Jim's stinginess than it did with the fact that Ferndale Farm was on the verge of bankruptcy. If I hadn't known better, which I did, I do not believe in curses, I'd have believed that our entire family had been hexed when it came to money. I was on the verge of bankruptcy myself, although there were extenuating circumstances. It was a long, sad story and involved my ex-husband, Rob, who was currently doing 10 years in prison for defrauding over 100 senior citizens out of several $1 million. Not that any of that money was left by the time I found out what Rob had been up to. Now I was left with a slew of loans he'd taken out with me as a cosigner. That's what I got for trusting him and signing things without reading them. I should have just declared bankruptcy and been done with it. But for some reason no one, not even me, understood. I felt responsible for paying all that money back. I'm happy with a simple life, always have been, but Rob never was. A big house, a shiny new car every couple of years, and lavish vacations cost a lot to keep up. Rob kept up the pretense of wealth to the bitter end. 3 days before the FBI closed in, he'd come home with a new Lexus. All that was over, now, thank heaven, and I was no longer a married woman. It had turned out that cheating on his taxes and defrauding senior citizens wasn't the only form of infidelity Rob had been engaging in behind my back. I'd just realized it all a little too late. Now I was single, ridden with debt, and planted beets for a living. I was happier than I'd ever been with my hands in the dirt every day. Unfortunately, my life as a farm girl was about to come to an end. When we got down to the house, Mateo herded me into an overstuffed love seat in the corner of the living room, put a glass of whiskey that seemed to be mostly soda in one hand, and a saucer containing an enormous slice of pecan pie in the other. "You all right, Red?" he asked me. His brown eyes looked troubled, and I didn't think it was just because he, too, was about to be leaving Ferndale Farm. He had lots of options. I didn't. "I'm fine," I told him. "Well, let me know if you need anything. I'll be out back tending the barbecue." Mateo did not bring me things. He also did not inquire after my welfare unless one counted tongue-in-cheek inquiries into my sanity. I wasn't sure how I felt about this upgraded version of Mateo. Mateo 2.0 made me nervous, and I watched his retreating back as he threaded his way through the crowd in the living room, stopping to greet people as he went, shaking hands with the men and hugging the women. Some of the women held on to him a little too long, I couldn't help noticing. I'd always acknowledged, although only to myself, that Mateo was a catch. For someone else. My friend Mia, maybe. Mateo is smart, good-looking, tall, and an interesting conversationalist when he isn't in fact-checking mode. Most importantly, he's kind and generous in his own gruff way, although he's more the sort who prefers to do good by stealth, so it took me a while to figure that out. "How are you holding up?" Alice asked as she wedged herself in beside me on the love seat. I hastily averted my eyes from Mateo, but I think she'd already noticed I was watching him, not that it meant anything. "I'm like my cat, Rocket. I'm attracted to movement, that's all." I focused all my attention on Alice. Her eyes were swollen and rimmed with red. She looked even shorter and thinner than usual, and her curly gray hair stuck out unevenly from her head as if she had been running her fingers through it. Running her fingers through her hair was a habit Alice had when she was feeling distressed. "The lawyer will be here in a few minutes," Alice told me. "Bud would like us both to be there for the reading of the will." Chapter 2. True to form, Uncle Jim's lawyer looked nothing like a lawyer. Bud Aldridge was not only a licensed attorney, he was also one of Uncle Jim's bowling buddies and ran the Otter Bay Little Theater. Bud operated his law practice from a single wide trailer on the outskirts of the village of Ferndale, Oregon. If you blink as you go through Ferndale, you'll miss it. The reading of the will took place in Alice and Jim's ground floor bedroom. Jim had called the old and rickety farmhouse home for the past 50 years. It was unsettling to think of someone else owning it. Would they tear the house down? A sensible person probably would. The wake was still going on in full force outside Alice and Uncle Jim's bedroom, and the hubbub of the crowd outside raising their voices to be heard over the bluegrass blasting from the old tape deck on top of the china hutch in the dining room made quite a din. Bud took a seat on the old rocker in the corner while Alice and I perched on the edge of the ludicrously high old-fashioned four-poster bed and waited. Bud drummed his fingers on the manila envelope I assumed contained the will, but made no move to open it. "Are we waiting for someone else?" I asked. I couldn't imagine who we might be waiting for. Except for Alice, I was Uncle Jim's only family. Unless Uncle Jim intended to leave bits and pieces to all his many friends and acquaintances from the village of Ferndale, I couldn't think of who else he might have left a bequest. It also seemed unlikely that every person who received any small item from Uncle Jim should be required to sit through the reading out of the will. "We are waiting for Mateo," Alice told me. Mateo? Uncle Jim had always been fond of Mateo. In fact, Mateo was likely the only reason Ferndale Farm hadn't had to declare bankruptcy already. Mateo was a boat builder by trade. He still kept a shop out at Otter Bay 10 miles away on the coast, where his brother and several apprentices kept the business going. 2 years ago, Mateo had come to work full-time at Ferndale Farm. I'd never been quite clear on how Uncle Jim and Mateo had come to such an arrangement. Mateo had what Uncle Jim always described as business savvy, but I failed to see what was so savvy about abandoning a thriving business to come work on a failing organic farm. But then, Mateo was also the one who'd been claiming since the age of 16 that he was going to sail around the world someday, so perhaps he was not as savvy as Uncle Jim made him out to be. The whole sail round the world thing was not some idle boast. Mateo was restoring an ancient family heirloom sailboat, which he'd whimsically christened the Petunia, for the express purpose of taking her on the trip. The Petunia used to be named the Patsy after Mateo's great-grandmother. The Patsy, or the Petunia as she was now called, had been in the Rossi family for 3 generations. Unfortunately, Mateo married a woman named Patsy 3 days after high school graduation. Patsy left Mateo after 2 short years of marriage to move to Tampa with a podiatrist and took the dog with her. That was the end of the Patsy, and the Petunia was born. "Sorry I took so long," Mateo said as he shut the door to the bedroom behind him, only partially blocking out the hubbub. "I had to find someone to take over the grill." "You'd better sit down for this," Bud told him. I couldn't imagine what Uncle Jim was leaving either Mateo or me. I hadn't actually seen the state of Uncle Jim and Alice's bank account, but I'd gotten the distinct impression that any little bit that was left Alice would need for whatever came next for her as she transitioned to widowhood. I was certain that most of Uncle Jim's money was tied up in Ferndale Farm, and he'd sworn for years that he was going to give the whole place, lock, stock, and barrel, to further research into organic farming methods. Uncle Jim had made it abundantly clear on numerous occasions that on his death, Ferndale Farm was going to the University of Oregon Agriculture Department. Part of Uncle Jim's reason for not leaving the farm to Alice was, I suspected, because Alice had no interest nor ability to try and keep her late husband's dream going. During Uncle Jim's last days at the hospital, Alice had informed me that she planned to move to Oklahoma to be near her daughter from her first marriage. She intended to go right after the funeral. I'd miss Alice, of course, but it was a move that made sense to me, and I wished Alice all the best. Mateo, as instructed by Bud, had found a seat on the top of the clothes hamper next to an old chest of drawers. Bud opened the manila envelope and withdrew a thin stack of papers with a flourish. "I will now read the will of Mr. James McCall," he said in a voice more suitable for playing the Ghost of Christmas Past at the Otter Bay Little Theater. I tuned out most of the legal jargon that preceded the actual listing of the bequests, but when I heard the words, "I, James McCall, being of sound mind and acting of my own free will do bequeath Ferndale Farm, including all land, livestock and implements, jointly to Ciara McCall and Mateo Russo," I couldn't believe my ears. "YS," was all I could think to say. Chapter 3. When Uncle Jim's lawyer, Bud, told us that Mateo and I had jointly inherited Ferndale Farm, I was thinking, YS. Mateo was the first one to actually get the words out. "I don't understand," he said. "Why both of us?" "Jim thought you might not," said Bud, extracting an old handheld recorder from the gallon metal lunchbox that served as his briefcase. "That's why he left this, too." Bud held up the recorder, pressed a button on the side so that it was at full volume and Uncle Jim's voice flooded the room. "I'm leaving Ferndale Farm to you too, and it's no good protesting about it, Ciara," Uncle Jim's voice proclaimed from beyond the grave. It seemed there was more to the recording, but Bud pressed the pause button and said, "I forgot to finish reading the terms." "Terms?" I said. "There are terms," Bud said, returning to his voice of the ghost of Christmas past, to read the next section of the document he held in his hand. Ciara McCall and Matteo Rossi shall, for the period of 12 calendar months, refrain from disposing of any portion of Ferndale Farm, excepting livestock, produce, and implements, or all property shall immediately be liquidated, and the proceeds subsequently donated to Comparine Seed Corporation Legal Defense Fund. Comparine Seed Corporation is the antithesis of everything organic farmers stand for. Comparine was currently in the act of being countersued by a slew of small organic farmers after the evil conglomerate had tried to enforce their patent rights on hybrid seed lines that had escaped their own fields and infected neighboring organic heirloom crops with their genetic material. We hadn't personally been targeted by Comparine, but my Uncle Jim hated the company with a passion, and I had almost as strong of feelings as my late uncle did. "Why would he do that?" I asked. Uncle Jim hated Comparine. "Does Comparine even have a legal defense fund?" Matteo asked. "Is a condition like that even enforceable?" I said. I had my doubts, but Bud was Uncle Jim's lawyer and clearly on his late friend's side, so he ignored both Matteo and me and held up a handheld recorder once more. "Jim left some last words," Bud said and pressed play. Uncle Jim's voice, once again, flooded the room. "I can't make you keep Ferndale Farm, but I want you to promise me you'll give it a year. Don't you even think about selling up, Ciara, to pay off those debts that no good ex-husband of yours left you, and you, Matteo, don't even think about taking that old tub of yours on some harebrained trip around the world until you've given Ferndale Farm a fair chance. Ciara needs you." I did need Matteo if I was going to have the slimmest chance of saving Ferndale Farm, but it made me squirm to hear my uncle say it out loud like that. "I don't know what to say," I said after Bud shut the recorder off. "You don't have to say anything," Bud told me, "just sign here." He handed over a document to me and then another to Matteo. I signed, acknowledging that I had been made aware of the contents of James McCall's last will and testament. I read it first, though. I may have been a fool in the past, but I read documents now. "What about Alice?" I asked. I'd been so flummoxed at the contents of the will and so focused on Matteo's equally shocked reaction to our joint inheritance of Ferndale Farm that I had not been monitoring how Alice was taking all this in. When I looked over, she was struggling to suppress a smile. "You knew?" I said to Alice. The farm had been solely in Uncle Jim's name, not that Alice couldn't have claimed survivor's rights if she'd wanted to. Uncle Jim could have pulled off a stunt like that without Alice knowing, but based on her smug expression, I was sure she'd had a big part in Uncle Jim's decision to leave Ferndale Farm to Matteo and me. Alice didn't say a thing. She just shrugged and smiled like the Cheshire Cat. "Was this your idea?" I asked Alice. She just shrugged again and kept on smiling. Although she was a sweet old thing, Alice liked to meddle. Somewhere along the line, I don't know how, since Matteo and I fought like cats and dogs, Alice had gotten the idea that Matteo and I were meant for each other. Don't get me wrong, I was semi-fond of Matteo. He was a good man, even if he did drive me crazy. However, I'd turned 35 the previous month, and Matteo was closing in on 36. It was my position that if Matteo and I were going to discover we had more than friendly feelings for each other, we'd have done it by now. I'd explained this to Alice repeatedly. My logic had fallen on deaf ears. I looked over again at Alice. She was practically smirking. She could deny it all she wanted, but leaving Matteo and me the farm had definitely been her idea. The thing was, that even if Alice had been the instigator, I had a sneaking suspicion that Uncle Jim hadn't taken much talking into to leave Ferndale Farm to me. I loved the place. I'd been coming there since I could barely walk. Farming was in my blood. To be honest, it had always made me a little sad that he'd been so set on letting the farm leave the family. And I was the only family he'd had left. Why Matteo was inheriting the farm was another matter. It wasn't that Uncle Jim wasn't fond of Matteo, either. It was just that such a transparent attempt to throw us together on this scale had Alice's fingerprints all over it. I could hardly accuse her of it to her face, however. Not with Matteo sitting there, perched on top of the clothes hamper, looking shell-shocked. He would have looked even more shocked if I had informed him that someone sitting in that room believed he and I were soulmates. That person was definitely not me. "I'll have to think about this," I said to no one in particular. "What's there to think about?" Alice protested. "It's all so sudden," I said. "What about you?" "My daughter called this morning and told me she'd found me a little house for rent just down the road from her in Norman, Oklahoma. Don't worry about me. I have school teacher retirement and Social Security. I'll be fine without the farm." "Are you sure?" "I'll miss this place, but I was never cut out to be a farmer. We all know that. I made it work when I moved here 10 years ago because I loved Jim so much." Alice had switched from looking smug to tears in a matter of seconds. I reached out and patted her hand. It was futile to protest any longer. It would just upset Alice further. I decided the sensible thing to do was to make an appointment with Bud and discuss what all this really meant when I'd had a chance to let it sink in. Of course, the other person I really needed to talk things through with was Matteo. I was sure he had a lot of questions about why we'd been made joint heirs to Ferndale Farm. Unfortunately, I wasn't about to tell him the truth. Telling Matteo that this was all just a scheme Alice had cooked up to throw us together was unthinkable. After the barbecue was over, the mourners, or celebrants, it was hard to tell which in their inebriated state, had been safely packed off with designated drivers or loved ones who came to collect them. Alice, Matteo, and I were left to clean up the mess. "We need to talk," I whispered to Matteo as I tried to stuff a stack of paper plates covered in chicken bones and the skins of fire-roasted potatoes into the overflowing trash bin beside the back porch. "We do," he whispered back. "When we're done here, I'll take you home, and we can have a talk." Chapter 4. Matteo doesn't drink. So, when he offered to take me home, I didn't say no. Between the glass of watered-down whiskey, the sleep deprivation, the sadness, and the shock of inheriting the farm, I didn't feel safe to drive. Besides, I lived next door to one of my best friends, Ruby, and I could easily text her to pop over if things got too awkward between Matteo and me. I lived in a little one-bedroom cottage in the oldest part of the village of Ferndale, behind a large rundown Victorian that had been divided into a duplex about 30 years ago. Ruby and her twins lived in one half of the duplex, and a single dad, Sid, and his 2 kids lived in the other. The whole place needed work. A lot of work. But the rent was cheap, so none of us complained. Matteo had only been to my house once. We didn't have the kind of relationship where we went to each other's places. "You want a cup of coffee or something?" I asked Matteo. He was sitting awkwardly on my old couch and making overtures to my cat, Rocket. Rocket got his name because every time anyone came to see me, he rocketed under the nearest piece of furniture. On this occasion, Rocket had squeezed himself into a small space behind the bookcase that stood on the opposite wall from the couch and was hiding there, although he'd occasionally peek up over the top of the books to keep an eye on Matteo. "I wouldn't mind some coffee," said Matteo, "if you've got decaf." I said I did have decaf and rattled around in my little kitchen, starting up the coffee maker. While the coffee percolated, I came back out to the living room and found Matteo on his hands and knees, peering into the recesses of the bookcase. "You won't get him to come out like that," I said. "You have to ignore him, then he might warm up to you. It's the only way." "Is that the method for success?" Matteo asked. "It doesn't seem to work on you." Then he looked up at me so long with his big brown eyes that I cleared my throat and said, "What are we going to do about Ferndale Farm?" "I don't see that we have much of a choice other than to make it work." "But it isn't even working now," I protested. "We both know the place is one minor mishap away from going under." "I have some ideas," Matteo said as he got up off my living room rug. I had some ideas, too, and I suspected they were good ones, but I'd always been too chicken to bring them up. My Uncle Jim hadn't been one for making changes. In fact, it had been like pulling teeth to get him to try a crop of new potatoes in the east field instead of filling the entire acre with beets, as he had for the past 20 years. "What are your ideas?" Mateo asked. "Mia thinks if we did more specialty crops, herbs and berries and baby greens. You know, things with higher yield per square foot, we could quickly increase our income." My friend Mia was a chef. She worked at a high-end restaurant in Portland, and she was always bugging me with ideas of how Ferndale Farm could capitalize on selling direct to restaurants. "Write it all down," said Mateo. "Put down everything Mia has ever suggested." "What are your ideas?" I asked. "I'm thinking that we could turn the farm into a tourist destination. We're only 10 miles from Otter Bay. Tons of people come through there in the summer, and with a little advertising." Mateo trailed off. He wasn't wrong about all those summer tourists. I'd considered the possibility, too. The problem was that if we turned Ferndale Farm into a tourist destination or increased our specialty crops, it wasn't something that the two of us could begin to handle on our own. "We'd have to hire some more people," I said. "You're right, we would have to hire more people," said Mateo, "quite a few more people." I didn't even bother saying aloud that we didn't have the money for that. All I had was debt, and I couldn't possibly ask Mateo to sink his own savings into Ferndale Farm. I didn't know how much Mateo had laid by, but I knew he'd been saving for years to fund his dream of taking off on his round-the-world adventure. "We'll figure something out," said Mateo. "Maybe we could." But he never finished his thought because our brainstorming session was interrupted by a banging on my front door. Chapter 5. The banging on my front door continued until I went and flung it open. I found Ruby standing on the doorstep. "Why didn't you just come in?" I asked her. "Ruby and I don't usually knock before we go into each other's houses. We just yell as we come in the door." "You have company," said Ruby in a sing-song voice that made me want to shush her up, but I couldn't without being obvious. "Why does that matter?" I asked. "Oh," she said, "I don't know." "It's just Mateo," I said, making things worse than they already were. Mateo was watching all this from his vantage point, still perched on the edge of my couch. He'd ignored Rocket, as I'd suggested, and the cat was creeping out from behind the bookcase, but Mateo seemed to have lost interest in the cat. He was also looking far more amused than I would have liked. "I have big news," I told Ruby. "About you too?" she asked, pointing first to me and then to Mateo. I could have sunk through the floor with embarrassment. "No," I said. "Well, actually, it kind of is. Uncle Jim left the farm to both of us." "Both of you?" It was a big shock, I admitted, and you know the kind of financial shape things are in. "That's why Mateo is here. We're going over some ideas." "I wish I could stay and help you," said Ruby, although I had invited her to do no such thing. "But I have to go to work in half an hour." "Sid keeping the kids?" I asked. "Of course," said Ruby. She was looking at me as if to say, who else would take them? Ruby's twins are quite a handful. I speak from experience. Sid and Ruby not only share a duplex and childcare, but they also work at the same place, the Seaview Hotel in Otter Bay. Sid works the front desk days, and Ruby works the graveyard shift. She claims working nights is easier, although it would drive me round the bend to be up all night, every night. Sid and Ruby met 6 years ago when she was a waitress at the hotel restaurant, and he was washing dishes. Over the years, they and their respective offspring have become a de facto family unit. Ruby insists there's absolutely nothing of a romantic nature between her and Sid, but sometimes I wish they'd wake up some morning and discover they'd fallen madly in love with each other, and I've said as much. Ruby didn't appreciate it. She feels about people trying to fix up her and Sid about the same way I feel about people trying to fix up Mateo and me. It was a folks who live in glass houses should not throw stones situation, and I was tempted to make some smart remark about her and Sid. "We'll talk later," said Ruby, "about your big news." She looked again from me to Matteo and back to me again. It was getting on my nerves. "Why are you here?" I asked. "I wanted to borrow your vacuum cleaner. Ours is on the blink again." "I thought you were about to go to work," I said. "It's for Sid," said Ruby. "He's going to clean the whole place, upstairs and down, while I'm at work." I should not have said what I said next, but I was irritated with Ruby. "You know, Ruby, you really ought to go ahead and marry him." Ruby wrinkled up her nose. "That's the pot calling the kettle black," she said. I love Ruby, but sometimes she lacks tact. I tossed a pillow at her, but hit Rocket instead. The cat had skulked over to Ruby and was winding in and out of her legs. Getting hit with the pillow sent Rocket skittering back behind the bookcase. "You and Matteo should consult with Mia," Ruby said. "She'll have tons of good ideas." "I already told Matteo that," I said. "Maybe, after we get the rest of the beets planted, we'll take an afternoon off and drive up to Portland to have a chat with her." But, as it turned out, before I even had a chance to ask Mia to come through with the help she'd offered 100 times, she called me with big news of her own. That evening, just as I was getting ready for bed, my phone rang. It was Mia. The first words she said to me were, "Ciara, I've been fired." Chapter 6. You got what? I screeched into the phone when my friend Mia told me she'd gotten fired. What happened? Mia worked for one of the best restaurants in Portland. She was an accomplished chef. She had high standards for herself and took great pride in a job well done. According to Mia, a job well done required the best in raw materials. Mia and the owner of the restaurant were constantly clashing over the sourcing of ingredients. The owner was perpetually ready to make do with the cheapest they could get away with, while Mia refused to settle for anything but the best. She insisted that their clientele deserved only the best at the prices they were paying. She believed that all the ambience in the world wouldn't make up for inferior cuisine, but the owner, Arnold, would rather put money into redoing the lighting and buying new china instead of spending what Mia felt was necessary on quality ingredients. "So, things with Arnold finally came to a breaking point?" I said. "Literally. I broke a whole stack of plates on my way out." "Really?" "Yes, really. I'm sure he'll take it out of my last paycheck, but I don't care." I started to say something sympathetic, but Mia continued talking right over me. "I'm probably done working for any restaurant in Portland, up to and including Big Booba's Burgerama." I said some things that I can't even believe came out of my own mouth. I wouldn't blame him if he blacklisted me. "What exactly did you say?" I asked. "I'd rather not tell you what I said. Let's just say that if he doesn't file a restraining order against me, Arnold's not thinking straight." "Oh, dear," I said. In Mia's defense, I've never known her to be physically violent, unless one counts that unfortunate stack of plates, but when she gets worked up, anyone in their right mind would be forgiven for wondering if they shouldn't put several miles or at least a piece of heavy furniture between themselves and Mia. Maybe, I need to move to an ashram and gain mastery over my emotions. "You could always come work at Ferndale Farm," I said. "I thought you were about to become unemployed," said Mia. "I thought your Uncle Jim was leaving the farm to Oregon State University." I thought so, too. But instead, he left it to Matteo and me. Matteo the boatman? Captain McDreamy, yachtsman extraordinaire? Matteo, who probably was a merman in his last incarnation. Mia had a crush on Matteo when I first introduced them to each other. He never seemed to notice, and her infatuation with him had dissipated considerably since, but she still didn't understand why I failed to find the man irresistibly attractive. The truth was that I did find him attractive. Moderately. Although, I'd never admitted it. Matteo was not, however, so attractive that he rated being called Captain McDreamy, and if he was a mythological creature in any of his past lives, he was probably something irritating, like one of those trolls that hide under bridges and spring out to scare people. If you are asking if I'm referring to Matteo Rossi, then yes, I told Mia. Uncle Jim made him joint heir of the farm. I never really believed that your Uncle Jim would leave the farm to research. He loved you like a daughter, you know. I did know, but Uncle Jim had had us all convinced that he really did mean to leave the farm to the university. Well, maybe everyone except for Alice. I'm pretty sure it was Alice's idea to leave it to both of us, I told Mia. You know how she's always believed Matteo and I were meant for each other. Mia started laughing hysterically on the other end of the line, partly, I believe, because of the stress of her horrible day and partly because she's always found Alice's determination to turn Matteo and me into a couple highly amusing. There's more, I said. More to Matteo? I've been telling you that for years, said Mia. You really need to. No. I cut her off. I mean, there was more to the will. My Uncle Jim stipulated that Matteo and I give Ferndale Farm a fair chance for a year before we can sell up. Or what? Or the whole place gets liquidated, and the money goes to the Comparine Legal Defense Fund. I don't imagine Comparine has a legal defense fund, said Mia. They certainly don't deserve to have one. Who'd donate to? That's what I said, I told her, and I don't know that anyone would enforce the terms of Uncle Jim's will. But it seems it really was important to him that we make one last attempt to save Ferndale Farm, so I don't see what choice we have. What are you going to do? Matteo and I had a talk earlier. We kicked around some ideas, and we're going to give it our best shot. I know you were joking when you said I could come work at Ferndale Farm, Mia said. But have you thought about the possibility of doing catered events? If I don't end up doing the ashram thing after all. We have thought of doing events. Matteo thinks we could turn the farm into a tourist destination. Pop-up diners are wildly popular right now, Mia said. You wouldn't have to open a full-fledged restaurant. You could just do reservation-only brunches and dinners every couple of weeks and maybe take on some wedding receptions. You wouldn't believe how much you can charge a plate for those things. I believed her. It sounds awfully complicated, I said. And we could pay you hardly anything at all. You'd end up doing very little cooking and a lot of digging potatoes and mucking out the goat barn. I know, but I'm fed up. If I can't find an ashram to take me, maybe I'll just go live in a tent in the woods and become a hermit. Don't go to that extreme, I said. The house at Ferndale Farm has plenty of rooms. That was true. The big old rambling farmhouse had no less than 6 bedrooms, all of which were small and creaky, hot in the summer and drafty in the winter. But, nevertheless, there was room in that house for at least 6 people, more if some of those people didn't mind sharing. Are you serious? Mia asked. I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure of much of anything. I was feeling completely out of my depth, to be honest. I'll have to talk to Matteo, I said. I understand, said Mia, but if you are serious about having me come and help you get a catering arm of the enterprise going, the lease on my apartment is up in 2 weeks. Chapter 7. Bright and early the next morning, Matteo and I set to work planting out the rest of the beet seedlings. For most of the morning, I barely saw Matteo. We worked through the remaining section of the field methodically. I started on the rows on one side, and he started on the other. Occasionally, we'd meet at the greenhouse when we went for more trays of seedlings. During one of these chance meetings, I told him that Mia had been fired. She offered to come to help out, I said. Are you sure she wasn't joking? I'm fairly sure. She has lots of ideas. She thinks we could make a killing on pop-up dinners and maybe wedding receptions. That sounds awfully complicated, said Matteo. It sounded complicated to me, too, but I was feeling defensive, so I told Matteo I was sure we could figure it out. I'm not saying it's a bad idea, said Matteo, catching on to my tone, but before we go promising anyone a job, we'd better both sit down and take a long hard look at the books. He was right. We also need to talk about the house, I said. Alice is moving out next week, and we shouldn't just leave the place empty. I'm thinking about giving up my rental and moving in. I was thinking that, too, Matteo told me. It doesn't make sense for me to keep commuting 10 miles twice a day from my place in Otter Bay. Especially not this time of year when there's all the planting to be done. Well, I could keep my place. I don't have to move into the house. I don't see any reason we couldn't both live there, said Matteo. It's not like there isn't room for both of us. I couldn't think of a compelling reason to tell him no, but suddenly, I wished Alice was staying. If she stayed, it wouldn't be so weird for Matteo and me to share the house. I decided to ask Alice to consider delaying her move the first chance I got. Matteo and I ate the lunches we'd brought from home as we sat on a log a few feet off the edge of the beet field. We didn't say much during lunch, but just as I was stuffing the remains of my sandwich back into my bag, Matteo said, I might be able to come up with the money to hire Mia and a couple of others. How? I have a little saved up. You mean your sail around the world on the Petunia Fund? Matteo didn't answer. I didn't know how much it took to sail around the world, but I imagined it had taken Matteo a long time to save up for his dream adventure. I had a sinking feeling that we could run through thousands of dollars a month just like that and have nothing to show for it in the end. Don't do that. I said. Don't do what? Don't sink everything you've got into Ferndale Farm. It'll either make it on its own, or it won't. No good comes from throwing good money after bad. Matteo didn't say anything more about the money. He screwed the lid back onto his thermos and shoved it into his lunchbox. We'd better get moving again, he said as he stood to his feet, or we won't finish today. That evening, just as it was getting dark, we finished putting in the last of the beet seedlings. We did it, Matteo said, giving me a grimy high five at the end of the last row. I'm heading home. I'm going to stop by and check on Alice, I told him. I didn't tell Matteo that I was going to try and convince Alice to stay. The thought of sharing the house, just me and Matteo, gave me a little quivering feeling in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't tell if it was excitement or apprehension. Either way, I knew it was a bad idea. I found Alice in the kitchen, packing up the set of antique china she'd brought with her when she'd moved in with Uncle Jim. I'd eaten scores of meals off those plates during the decade she'd been married to my uncle. Alice was wrapping the tea service in paper, and when I walked in the back door of the kitchen, she stood to greet me. I could see she'd been crying. You have no idea how much I'm going to miss you, I told Alice as I stood there in the kitchen hugging her. I'm going to miss you, too, Ciara, she told me. You know, you don't have to go, I said. I know that, said Alice. No one is chasing me away. Would you consider sticking around a few more months? I don't know what I could possibly do to help, said Alice. I'd just be underfoot. You know I'm hopeless at farming. Well, for a start, you could keep us fed, I told her. Matteo and I have been talking. Good, said Alice. Pleased to hear it. We're thinking about hiring my friend Mia. She's a chef. If she's a chef, then you don't need me to stay around and cook for you. She wouldn't just be a chef, I told Alice. She'd only have time to cook for special events. The rest of the time, she'd end up helping us with grunt work around the farm. I tried to imagine Mia doing grunt work around the farm and failed entirely, but I wasn't about to tell Alice I had my doubts about Mia as a farmer. It wouldn't just be cooking, I said. If we have a bunch of people living here, it would be enormously helpful to have someone taking care of the house and the cooking so the rest of us can concentrate on working long hours in the fields. I don't know, said Alice. That was a more favorable response than I had anticipated. Promise me you'll think about it, I said. I'll think about it, said Alice. Chapter 8. I think Alice really is considering delaying her move to Oklahoma, I told Matteo the next morning as we sat together in the downstairs room of the farmhouse. It had once been the parlor but now functioned as the farm office. When Matteo had said we needed to go over the books, what he really meant was he needed to get me up to speed. Matteo had been managing Ferndale Farm's finances for the last 2 years, or at least managing them as well as he had been allowed to. I had a feeling that one of the reasons Ferndale Farm wasn't turning a profit was that my Uncle Jim, perpetually resistant to change, had been less than amenable to Mateo's probably sensible suggestions. "How bad is it?" I asked Mateo. He had several stacks of stapled spreadsheets laid out on the desk, as well as Uncle Jim's handwritten ledger. My uncle had refused to touch the computer Mateo had brought over from the office in his boat shop. "It's pretty bad," said Mateo. He was not going to sugarcoat the situation, and I appreciated that. "I know the farm is losing a little money almost every month," I said, "but on average, how much over the last 12 months? Averaging all the losses together, Ferndale Farm is running at a deficit of several thousand a month." "How many is several?" "3. So, you're telling me that over the last year, Ferndale Farm has not only had no profit but has lost $36,000, give or take." "That is what I'm telling you," said Mateo. "But where's the money to cover the losses coming from? Where did Uncle Jim get $36,000 to flush down the toilet?" "He's been borrowing most of it, although I did manage to finagle a little subsidy money from the federal government, and I applied for a small grant from a foundation that supports organic farming." "What's the final number?" I asked. "How big is the debt?" "The total amount of outstanding loans is $157,346.28. How are we ever going to make a go of it? It'll be like trying to dig out of a hole when the sides keep collapsing in on top of you." Mateo didn't try to make me feel better. He didn't give me a pep talk or offer any pie-in-the-sky platitudes. "What are we going to do?" I asked. "Well, we have lots of ideas," said Mateo, "and I believe they are good ones. We'll just have to try them one by one and see what sticks." "What if none of them stick?" I asked. "If none of them stick and the debt keeps accruing," said Mateo, "then come 12 months from now, when we sell up, the proceeds of the sale will satisfy the liens against the farm." "How much do you think Ferndale Farm is worth?" I asked. "Conservatively, I'd say about $3 million. $3 million! I screeched so loudly that Alice, who was out in the living room taking framed pictures off the wall and sandwiching them between sheets of cardboard, peeked in the door and asked what the matter was. Nothing, I said. "Everything's fine." "I'll bring you some cookies," said Alice. "They just came out of the oven." I'd been smelling cookies for the past 20 minutes. I was pretty sure they were ginger snaps, my favorite. I hoped that Alice baking my favorite cookies wasn't some kind of farewell present. After Alice shut the door behind her, I said to Mateo, "You're telling me that if we could sell this place tomorrow, we'd get nearly $3 million out of it?" "That is what I'm telling you." That put a whole new light on things. I could understand why my Uncle Jim had been so adamant in his recorded message that I not even think about selling Ferndale Farm to pay off my debts. The $150,000 that the farm owed was nothing in comparison to the debts my ex-husband had saddled me with. My own debts were nearly twice that, although I was paying interest on nearly all of them. I wasn't feeling tempted to try and push through the sale of the farm just to get rid of my own personal debts, but it was a comfort to know that in a year's time, if Mateo and I couldn't make the farm pay its way, selling up would satisfy both any debts the farm had accrued and my own. Unfortunately, the value of the farm itself did nothing to provide us with cash for day-to-day operating expenses unless we were prepared to take out even more loans. "I don't want to borrow any more money," I told Mateo. "You know how I feel about debt." "I do," said Mateo, "and, frankly, I don't think bankers will be lining up to lend us money, even with the farm as collateral." "Oh. But I don't think asking for more loans will be necessary." "Other than borrowing, what are our options?" I was able to get us a substantial grant. "Who from?" "There's a private donor," Mateo said, "an individual of means who has a keen interest in supporting small farms." "An individual?" I said. "Who is it?" "The individual wants to remain anonymous," said Mateo. Just then, Alice came in with a plate of cookies. "Mateo just told me that there's an anonymous donor who wants to give Ferndale Farm a chunk of money," I told her. is there? Alice didn't seem nearly as surprised as I had anticipated. How nice, she said and handed me a ginger snap. Chapter 9. As I was chowing down on Alice's delicious ginger snap, it occurred to me that I had omitted one important question. How much is this sizable donation? I asked Mateo. $250,000, he told me. Who in their right mind wants to give $250,000 to Ferndale Farm? I didn't really expect to get an answer, and I didn't. Mateo didn't even look at me. Instead, he went back to shuffling papers on the desk. There's someone I think we should hire, he said, I suspect partly because I needed to know that, and partly because he was transparently eager to change the subject. Oh? His name's Mo. He used to work for me at the shop. Mateo talked about Mo fairly often. They seemed to do a lot of things together, and even though Mo hadn't worked at the boat shop for years, he still rented one of the little apartments over the shop from Mateo. My strongest impression of the man was that he hardly talked. Mateo once described Mo as being as placid as a cow. I think hiring Mo is a good idea, said Mateo, but you have a say, too, so the final call is up to you. You think he's suited for farm work? Mateo just looked at me. I think he wanted to say that Mo was better suited for farm work than I was, but he didn't want to hurt my pride. If you want, he said, I'll set up an appointment with Mo, and you can give him an interview. I'd never interviewed anyone for a job in my life. But now that I was co-owner of Ferndale Farm, I had a feeling it was going to become a regular occurrence. Fine, I said. That's probably a good idea. What about Mia? You want to interview her, too? There's no need to interview Mia, said Mateo. If she's willing to come for what we can afford to pay her, I'm all for it. How much can we afford to pay her? I asked. Mateo scribbled a number down on a piece of paper and pushed it across the desk to me. It was more than I had expected. Is this per month? I asked, half expecting him to say it was for the whole quarter or something. Yes. That's more than Uncle Jim has been paying me. I know, Mateo said. You should give yourself a raise, too. Can we afford this? I asked. We have to afford this. If you don't pay decent wages, it's hard to get decent help. I begged to differ. Uncle Jim had had decent help. He just hadn't had enough of it. But I kept my mouth shut. Let me know when you've set up something with Mo, I told Mateo, and left it at that. The next morning, as I was mucking out the goat shed, Mateo came and found me. Your meeting with Mo is at 10 o'clock, he told me. I'll finish with the goat shed. 10? Where? I was covered head to toe with flecks of dirt and straw. I had a feeling I smelled strongly of goat manure. Otter Bay, Mateo told me. You want me to interview someone for a job looking like this? I asked. You want me to go reeking of eau de goat? An expression of annoyance flicked across Mateo's face. For a moment, I toyed with the possibility that it wasn't just annoyance, it was jealousy at my apparent apprehension of what Mo might think of my appearance. I quickly dismissed the notion. If Mo can't tolerate the smell of a little goat manure, he's probably not cut out for farming, Mateo told me. Where am I supposed to be meeting Mo? I told him you'd meet him at 10 at that little coffee place just down the street from the boat shop. I'm not going into any coffee shop looking and smelling like this, I said. I'll leave dirt prints on those white chairs. Mateo gave me a once-over, and I think it finally sunk in just how unpresentable I was because he told me he'd contact Mo again and suggest that we meet at his boat shop instead. I'll tell my brother you can use the office, Mateo said. I took 10 minutes down at the house to wash my face and scrub my hands and arms up to the elbow and change out of my muck boots, then I headed off for Otter Bay. When I got to the boat shop, Mateo's brother met me at the door and ushered me into the office, where Mo was already sitting in the only chair aside from the one behind the desk. I felt oddly boss-like when I sat down, but that was what I was, the boss, whether I liked it or not. You must be Mo, I said belatedly, getting up again and extending my hand. We'd met briefly a couple of times in passing, but that had been years ago, and I doubted Mo remembered me. Mo didn't say a word, but he stood up, towering over me, and took the hand I offered in a firm handshake. His palms were rough, his grip strong, and he was built like an ox, which boded well for his suitability for farm labor. "Matteo said you're willing to come work for us," I said when I'd sat down again behind the desk. Mo nodded yes. "Do you have any agriculture experience?" I asked. Mo nodded no. "What kind of work have you been doing?" "Carpentry." "Why do you want to come work at Ferndale Farm?" "Need a job." "What happened to your last job?" "Went under." "Your previous employer stopped doing business?" "Yep." "I see," I said, "but why do you want to work at Ferndale Farm specifically?" "I like the smell of dirt." That seemed as good an answer as any he could have given me. I liked the smell of dirt, too. To me, liking the smell of dirt was an excellent litmus test for suitability for farm work. "You're hired," I said. "Good." Clearly, Matteo hadn't been exaggerating when he'd portrayed his friend as not being much of a talker. But then, that was probably a good thing. "We're making 2 new hires," I told Mo. "We're also bringing on a friend of mine who's been working as a chef in Portland. She's decided to make a change." I didn't say that Mia had been fired, but I figured while I was on the subject, I might as well warn Mo that Mia had the potential to be difficult. I love Mia, and I wanted to put it diplomatically, so I said, "She's a bit of a firecracker." Mo didn't respond other than to give a long slow nod. "Her bark is worse than her bite," I said. I had a sudden vision of Mia and Mo standing in the middle of a newly plowed field, Mia yelling her head off about something or other, and Mo just standing there staring off into the distance as he was doing at that very moment. That was the sort of response that would only serve to make Mia madder. "Mia is very talented," I said, giving in to the sudden impulse to make excuses for her in advance. "We're hoping to do special events and dinners and things, so her cooking skill will be invaluable." I was babbling, and I think we both knew it. Mo gave me another long slow nod. I was about to conclude the interview when I had a sudden inspiration. I don't know what made me think that Mo might be privy to the identity of the anonymous donor, but I'd gotten the impression over the years that Matteo and Mo were extraordinarily close in their own way. So, I decided it wouldn't hurt to ask. "You know, we'll be making some big changes to the way the farm is run," I said. "We've recently been fortunate enough to receive a large donation to expand the operation." In response to my other statements, I had at least gotten eye contact and a long, slow nod, but this time Mo looked at his feet and started shuffling them. I couldn't be sure it was the subject of the anonymous donor that had him nervous, but it made me suspect that he knew more than I did about this mysterious benefactor's identity. "You wouldn't happen to know," was all I got out before Mo unfolded his enormous frame from the chair, stuck out his hand, and essentially declared the interview was over. Chapter 10. I shook Mo's outstretched hand and said, "While I'm here, I might as well say hi to Petunia. I'm afraid of the water, can't swim, and suspect that, if I were ever convinced to get into a boat, would manage to get seasick in the middle of a calm lake. So, I have no actual interest in sailing." But I had enjoyed watching the slow transformation of the Petunia over the years from wreck to what was shaping up to be quite an elegant craft. It was a habit of mine to stop by the shop most times I came over to Otter Bay and see what little changes had been made. The apprentices at the shop would work on the Petunia when they had pockets of spare time in between work for paying customers. I'd thought Mo looked nervous when I'd asked about the identity of the anonymous donor, but he looked even more nervous when I suggested stopping by to pay my respects to Petunia. "You can't," he said. "Why not?" I asked as I searched his face. I couldn't imagine what might have happened to her. "She's in storage," said Mo. "Why is she in storage?" "Matteo put her there," said Mo. "Why?" "He didn't say," said Mo. "Maybe they got a big job and need the room or something." That was quite a mouthful, by most standards, but I didn't believe a word of it. Emma was looking up at the ceiling and shuffling his feet again. No. I said. Please tell me Matteo didn't sell Petunia. I had an awful feeling that the reason Matteo wasn't willing to reveal the identity of this anonymous donor was that he was the anonymous donor. If my hunch was correct, that $250,000 had to come from somewhere, and unless Matteo's Sail Around the World fund was enormous, then he'd have had to sell something to raise the money. Matteo didn't sell the Petunia, Mo insisted, but I was fairly sure he was lying. I left Mo standing there in the office of the boat shop, shuffling his feet and looking terrified. I raced to my car and sped back to Ferndale Farm. I ran up the rickety back steps of the porch, burst into the kitchen, and asked Alice where Matteo was. I think he took the tractor out to plow the south field, Alice told me. Are you all right? Not really, I said. Do you know where Matteo got that money? What money? That $250,000. Alice pressed her lips together for a few seconds before collecting her wits and insisting that Matteo had gotten the money from an anonymous donor. She wasn't fooling me, I'd spent enough time around Alice to know when she was lying. Why did he sell Petunia? I wailed. He didn't. Alice insisted, but it was too late. I didn't believe a word she said. It took me 5 minutes to walk to the south field, and the more I walked, the angrier I got. I'd worked myself up into a tizzy by the time I'd gotten there. I had no evidence, but I was convinced that it was Matteo who'd both fronted the money and sold the Petunia in order to do it. He had no right. I had made it abundantly clear that I didn't want him sinking any of his money into Ferndale Farm. By the time I got to the south field, I was livid. I yelled and waved my arms until I got Matteo's attention. He idled the tractor, climbed off, and came over to meet me at the edge of the field. What's going on, Red? He demanded. Did the bull get out or something? No, I said, the bull did not get out. Did something catch on fire? He asked. No, something did not catch on fire. What is it, then? I'm wasting fuel and daylight here. It's you. I said. You had no right. I had no right to what? Said Matteo, looking in equal parts confused and guilty, as if he suspected the reason for my anger but wasn't entirely sure which thing it was that he had done that had me so steamed. Did you sell the Petunia? I wailed. You're crying, said Matteo. I hadn't realized I was crying until he pointed it out. That's the thing about me. I cry when I'm sad, and I cry when I'm mad. And at that moment, I was both. Did you sell the Petunia? I yelled again so loudly that if Alice had been out on the back porch, she probably could have heard me. No, I didn't sell the Petunia, said Matteo. I put her in storage. You're lying to me. I said. You sold the Petunia. That's where you got the money. What money? The $250,000. I said. Calm down, Red, said Matteo. I'll admit that I'm the anonymous donor, but that money came out of my savings account. The Petunia is sitting safely in a dry dock at Otter Bay. You're not lying to me? I said, finally calming down a little. I'm not lying to you, said Matteo. He was hugging me now. Matteo had never hugged me, but it didn't feel as awkward as I would have expected. Promise me that no matter what happens, you won't sell the Petunia, I said. I promise. Matteo was stroking my hair now, which was weird but oddly comforting. But why did you put up the money? I asked. Why would you put up your good money to save Ferndale Farm? You really don't know? Matteo asked. He pulled away from me a little now and looked me in the eye. I know you were fond of Uncle Jim, I said, but isn't blowing your Sail Around the World savings a little overboard? Maybe it's not your Uncle Jim I'm so fond of, said Matteo. Judging by the look on his face as he held me at arm's length, he was trying to say that it was me he was so fond of, but that didn't seem right, so I said, what are you trying to tell me? I'm trying to tell you that I'm in love with you. I think the bull really could have gotten out and tried to tango with the tractor still idling in the center of the field, and I wouldn't have noticed. I was so shocked that I opened my mouth, but no words came out. It's your turn to say something, Red, Matteo prompted. I don't believe you, I said when I finally found my voice. It sounded like I was accusing Matteo of lying about being in love with me, but that really wasn't it. It was more a matter of believing I'd somehow misunderstood. Matteo couldn't be in love with me. What if I kissed you? Matteo said. Would you believe me, then? I don't know, I said. Can I kiss you? Did I want him to kiss me? I kind of did. Yes, I said. Then Matteo was kissing me, and I was kissing him back. It was a lot nicer than I would have expected. He wrapped his hand around the back of my head, and it got even nicer. When he finally broke the kiss, Matteo didn't pull away. Instead, we stood there, at the edge of the field, our foreheads together and our breath mingling until I said, I'm very confused. It's okay to feel confused, Matteo said, pulling back so he could see my expression. I've had years to get used to the idea, and you've had about 3 minutes. That long? Years? Yep. I had no idea. Well, you were getting over Rob. I didn't want to rush you. I'm going to need some more time, I said. To get over Rob? No, to get used to the idea of you and me. Okay. I'll let you know. I trailed off. It didn't seem right to string Matteo along forever, especially since no matter what happened, we were going to be seeing each other on a near-daily basis for at least the next year. I'll give you an answer when we're done pulling beets, I said. That could be 6 weeks from now. Is that too long? No, Matteo said, although his face said otherwise. But I'll expect an answer as soon as the last beet is out of the ground. Chapter 11. Because we'd finished putting the seedlings in the ground a bit later than normal, it ended up being only 5 weeks by the time the last beet was pulled. During those 5 weeks, Matteo kept a respectful distance. We were nearly constantly together, but since Alice agreed to stay on, Mia moved in, and Mo was at Ferndale Farm from dawn till after supper time, there was plenty of buffer between us. Even sharing the house was less awkward than I'd anticipated, what with Mia and Alice always popping around the corner. I didn't breathe a word to anyone about the kiss nor Matteo's declaration that he was in love with me and had been for quite some time. It was a delicious but nerve-wracking secret I kept to myself. Mo was the one to pull the last beat, but Mia was the one to announce it. That's the last beat, she hooped so loudly that Alice could probably hear her down at the house. I'll see you at the greenhouse, I whispered to Matteo as I passed by him with my final crate of beets. We were stacking the full crates at the edge of the field to be trailered down to the barn where we'd top and wash each beet in preparation for sale at the Friday farmers market in Portland. I'll take that, Matteo said, lifting the crate from my arms. You're so tired you're shaking. I just need to eat, I insisted. I also needed a shower and a good night's sleep, but first, there was something I needed to say to Matteo, and it was long overdue. 10 minutes later, I was face to face with Matteo in the relative privacy of the greenhouse. Before you say what you're going to say, Matteo told me, I want to make it perfectly clear that even if you just want to be friends, it won't change anything to do with the farm. Good to know, I said, then fell silent. There were plenty of things I wanted to say, but I was having a hard time getting the words out. You know how much Rob hurt me, I said. I do know that. He really messed with my ability to trust anyone. I know that, too. And he made me hate money. What do you mean? I hate what money made him do. Money didn't make Rob do what he did, Matteo said. Greed did. That was true, but sometimes I had a hard time separating the two. I have a lot of debt, I said. I know that. And it bothers me. A lot. I know that, too, said Matteo. Where are you going with this? I could see why he was getting confused, but I was determined to lay all my misgivings on the table. I would just hate for you to think that I'm viewing you as a ticket out of debt, I said. Matteo started to laugh. Is that a proposal of marriage? What? Are you proposing that we go straight to a joint bank account? Of course not, I sputtered. That wasn't what I'd meant at all, although, thanks to Ferndale Farm, our financial futures were inextricably intertwined already. I was thinking more in terms of starting out slow, said Matteo. Maybe dinner and a movie and a kiss on the doorstep. We don't have time for dinner and a movie, I said. There's the spinach to cut tomorrow, there are the carrots to pull, and the goats need. Shoo, said Matteo, pulling me into his arms. I'll take a rain check on the dinner and the movie. I'd settle for a kiss on the doorstep. Which doorstep? This one, he said, backing me outside the greenhouse door to the pavers that kept the entrance from disintegrating into a mud pit. I think we'd been kissing for a while when we were interrupted by a wolf whistle. It was Mia. I knew it, she said. I knew you guys had to have. You didn't know anything, I protested, turning in Matteo's arms. Leave them alone, Emo told Mia. Make me. Mia shot back, but she followed him anyway, although she turned around to smirk at us a couple of times. Matteo and I stood there in front of the greenhouse watching Emo and Mia as they wandered off in the direction of the farmhouse and the delicious supper I was sure Alice had waiting for us. When Alice had brought sandwiches out to the beet field at lunchtime, she'd promised us pot roast for supper. Alice's pot roast is my favorite food in the whole world. It's even better than Alice's ginger snaps. When I tell you that I put off a plate of Alice's pot roast with baby carrots and new potatoes, you'll understand how eager I was to get back to kissing Matteo. The end. Did you enjoy this first story in the Ferndale Farm series? You may also enjoy Mia and Mo's story, Spud Muffin, which you can find in the Ferndale Farm series playlist.